The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Preston family home, painting golden stripes across the polished oak floors. George Preston stood in the foyer, suitcase in hand, his heart pounding beneath his crisp blue shirt. He glanced at the family portrait on the wall, himself, his late wife, and their only daughter, Emily, smiling in happier times. Now, the house felt colder, emptier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emily's voice echoed from the kitchen, bright and forced. "Dad, are you ready? The car's here." George forced a smile, masking the ache in his chest. He stepped into the kitchen, where Emily stood with her husband, Mark. Mark's arm was draped around Emily's shoulders, his smile just a little too wide, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Big day, George," Mark said, clapping him on the back. "You deserve this break. A cruise to the Caribbean, sun, sea, and no worries." George nodded, but something in Mark's tone made his skin prickle. He'd never trusted Mark, not since the day Emily brought him home, all charm and ambition. Mark had wormed his way into the family, always eager to help, always with a hidden agenda. George had seen the way Mark looked at the family business, the way he talked about modernizing things, about taking care of the future. But Emily was blind to it, swept up in Mark's confidence, eager to please her husband. George had tried to warn her, but she brushed him off, telling him to let go and enjoy life. Now, as he watched Mark hand him the cruise ticket, George's unease grew. He glanced at the ticket, his eyes narrowing. One way. No return date. Just a single passage to Miami, with a cruise ship waiting at the port. "You'll love it, Dad," Emily said, her voice trembling just a little. "You've worked so hard. You need to rest." George studied her face, searching for the daughter he'd raised, the girl who used to run to him with scraped knees and wild stories. But now, her eyes darted away, unable to meet his. Mark squeezed her shoulder, his grip possessive. "We'll handle everything here. You just relax." George's mind raced. Why a one-way ticket? Why now, after all these years? He thought of the business, the Preston hardware legacy, built from nothing by his own hands. He'd trusted Emily to inherit it, to keep it in the family. But lately, Mark had been pushing for changes, asking George to sign documents, just to make things easier. George had been careful, but he knew Mark was clever, always looking for an angle. As the car pulled up, George took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He hugged Emily, feeling her stiffen in his arms. "Take care of yourself, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. Mark loaded the suitcase into the trunk, then turned to George with a smirk. "Bon voyage, old man." George met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Thank you, Mark. I'm sure you'll take good care of things while I'm gone." Mark's smile faltered for a split second, then returned, even wider. "Of course. You can count on me." As the car pulled away, George looked back at the house. His life. He saw Mark's arm tighten around Emily, saw her wipe a tear from her cheek. Something was very wrong. The drive to the port was a blur. George stared out the window, replaying every conversation, every subtle shift in Emily's behavior. He remembered the late-night arguments, the way Mark always seemed to win. He remembered the day Mark convinced Emily to move the business accounts online, for efficiency. He remembered the documents Mark had pushed across the table, always with a reassuring smile. At the port, George stepped out of the car, the salty air stinging his eyes. He watched as the cruise ship loomed in the distance, a floating palace promising escape. But George wasn't running away. He was being sent away. As he boarded the ship, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He wasn't a fool. He'd seen enough in his 65 years to know when he was being played. He walked to his cabin, set down his suitcase, and sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through old messages from Emily, messages full of love and gratitude, before Mark came into the picture. He closed his eyes, letting the pain wash over him. But then, a spark of resolve flickered in his chest. If they thought they could get rid of him so easily, they were in for a surprise. He smiled to himself, remembering the envelope he'd left behind in his study, a small insurance policy, just in case. He'd spent the last week gathering documents, making copies, and writing a letter. He'd hidden it where only Emily would find it, hoping she'd read it before it was too late. As the ship's horn sounded, George stood and looked out the window, watching the shoreline recede. He wasn't sure what waited for him on the other side, but he knew one thing. He wasn't done fighting. Not yet. If you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes, the greatest battles are fought not with fists, but with patience, wit, and a father's love. And as George watched the sun dip below the horizon, he made a silent promise. Mark would regret ever underestimating him. The game had just begun. George Preston's story didn't begin with betrayal. It began in a small, sunlit workshop behind his father's house in Ohio, where he learned the value of honest work and family loyalty. The Preston name meant something in their town: integrity, reliability, a handshake that was as good as a contract. George built Preston Hardware from the ground up, turning a single storefront into a thriving business that put food on the table for dozens of families. He did it for his wife, Linda, and for their daughter, Emily, who grew up running through the aisles, her laughter echoing off the shelves. After Linda's passing, Emily became George's whole world. He poured his love and hopes into her, teaching her everything he knew about the business and about life. But as Emily grew older, she craved something more than small-town predictability. She went off to college, met Mark at a business seminar, and brought him home one Thanksgiving, her eyes shining with excitement. Mark was everything George wasn't: slick, ambitious, always talking about scaling up and leveraging assets. At first, George tried to welcome him, hoping Emily had found someone who would cherish her. But Mark's charm was a mask, and George saw the cracks early on. Mark was always asking questions about the business, always suggesting improvements that seemed to benefit him more than anyone else. He'd linger in George's office, watching him sign checks, making offhand comments about streamlining the process. Emily, blinded by love and Mark's confidence, started echoing his ideas. "Dad, you need to let go a little. Mark knows what he's doing. He just wants to help." George tried to trust her, but every instinct screamed at him to be careful. The real turning point came after Emily and Mark's wedding. Mark insisted on moving into the Preston family home, claiming it would save money and keep the family close. George agreed, wanting to keep Emily happy, but he noticed how Mark slowly took over, rearranging the office, hiring his own friends, pushing George to retire. The business started to change. Long-time employees were let go, replaced by Mark's associates. The books became harder to read, with new accounts and unexplained expenses. George confronted Emily, but she defended Mark, accusing her father of being stuck in the past. The final blow came when Mark convinced Emily to have George sign a stack of documents, just to update the records. George read every line, but Mark was clever, hiding the real transfer in a sea of legal jargon. By the time George realized what had happened, the business and the house were no longer in his name. He felt the ground shift beneath him, but he kept his pain hidden, not wanting to hurt Emily. Now, on the cruise, George replayed every moment, every warning he'd ignored. He remembered the night he overheard Mark on the phone, whispering in the study. "He'll be out of the way soon. One-way ticket. No loose ends." George's blood ran cold. He realized then that Mark didn't just want the business. He wanted George gone, out of sight, out of mind. That's when George started planning. He spent sleepless nights gathering evidence, making copies of every document he could find, and writing a letter to Emily, explaining everything. He hid the envelope in his study, behind a photo of Linda, knowing Emily would find it if she ever looked for comfort. On the ship, George's resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the Preston legacy, for the values his father taught him. He knew Mark's arrogance would be his undoing. Mark thought he'd covered every angle, but he'd made one fatal mistake. He underestimated George's love for his daughter. Back at home, Mark was already celebrating. He poured himself a drink in George's old study, feet up on the desk, grinning at the empty chair across from him. Emily sat on the couch, her eyes red from crying. "Do you think Dad will be okay?" she asked, her voice small. Mark waved her off. "He'll be fine. He needs this. Trust me, Em, it's for the best." But Emily's doubt lingered. She wandered into the study, drawn to the old family photos. Her fingers traced the frame of her mother's picture, and something caught her eye, a corner of an envelope tucked behind the glass. She hesitated, heart pounding, then pulled it free. Her name was written on the front in her father's steady hand. She stared at it, torn between fear and curiosity. Mark called from the kitchen, but Emily ignored him, clutching the envelope to her chest. She slipped upstairs, locking the door behind her. As she opened the letter, her hands shook. The first page was a heartfelt note from her father, full of love and regret. But the second page was different. Copies of documents, bank statements, and a detailed account of everything Mark had done. Emily's world tilted. She read and reread the pages, her mind racing. Could it be true? Had she really been so blind? Downstairs, Mark poured another drink, oblivious to the storm brewing above. Emily's tears fell onto the letter as she realized the depth of her mistake. She'd trusted the wrong person, and now her father was gone, maybe forever. But as she read the final line of George's letter, a new emotion took root: determination. "If you ever need me, Emily, you know where to find me. But you have to see the truth for yourself." The hook was set. The game was far from over. And as the sun set over the Preston home, Emily made a silent vow. She would find out the truth, no matter what it cost. The night before George's departure, the Preston house was quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves sensed the coming storm. George moved through the rooms with a heavy heart, each step echoing memories of laughter, arguments, and the simple joys of family life. He paused in the living room, running his hand over the back of Linda's favorite armchair, remembering how she'd sit there with a book, her gentle voice filling the space with warmth. Now, the chair was empty, and the air felt colder. Upstairs, Emily and Mark's voices drifted through the hallway, muffled but tense. George caught fragments: Mark's impatience, Emily's uncertainty. "He'll be fine, Em. You're doing the right thing," Mark insisted, his tone clipped. Emily's reply was softer, almost pleading. "But what if he needs us? What if he's not ready?" Mark's answer was a low growl. "He's holding you back. This is our chance to move forward." George closed his eyes, the words cutting deeper than he'd expected. He knew Mark saw him as an obstacle, a relic of the past. But what hurt most was hearing Emily's doubt, her struggle between loyalty to her father and devotion to her husband. He wanted to storm into their room, to shake her out of Mark's spell, but he knew it would only push her further away. Instead, he retreated to his study, the one place that still felt like his own. He sat at the old oak desk, the surface worn smooth by decades of work. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the envelope he'd prepared, his last line of defense. Inside were copies of every document Mark had tricked him into signing, along with a letter explaining everything. He wrote it in plain, honest language, hoping Emily would see the truth. He tucked the envelope behind Linda's photo, knowing Emily often sought comfort there. As he closed the drawer, a wave of sadness washed over him. He wondered if Emily would ever forgive him for leaving, or if she'd ever see Mark for who he truly was. Downstairs, Mark was already celebrating. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, toasting his own reflection in the window. "To new beginnings," he muttered, a smug grin on his face. George watched from the shadows, his jaw clenched. He saw the way Mark strutted through the house, already acting like the king of the castle. But George wasn't beaten yet. He had one more move to make. That night, as the house slept, George walked the halls one last time. He paused outside Emily's door, listening to her quiet sobs. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be all right, but he knew words wouldn't be enough. She had to see the truth for herself. In the early hours, George packed his bags, careful not to wake anyone. He took only what he needed: some clothes, his passport, and a small box of family mementos. He left his keys on the kitchen table, a silent goodbye. As he stepped outside, the cool night air stung his cheeks. He looked back at the house, his heart heavy with regret and resolve. He whispered a promise to Linda's memory: "I'll come back. I'll make this right." The next morning, Emily found the keys and the empty study. Panic flared in her chest. She rushed to the window, watching the car pull away with her father inside. Mark appeared behind her, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "It's for the best, Em. He'll thank you one day." But Emily wasn't so sure. She wandered into the study, drawn to her mother's photo. Her fingers brushed the frame, and she felt the envelope hidden behind it. Her breath caught. She pulled it free, her name staring back at her in her father's handwriting. Upstairs, she locked herself in her room, heart pounding. She opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the pages. The letter was full of love and sorrow, but the documents were damning. Bank statements, property transfers, signatures she didn't remember authorizing. Emily's hands shook as she realized the truth. Mark had orchestrated everything. He'd used her trust, her love for her father, to get what he wanted. Tears streamed down her face as she read the final lines. "I love you, Emily. I hope you find your way back to the truth. I'll always be here if you need me." Downstairs, Mark called out, but Emily ignored him. She stared at the evidence, her mind racing. Had she really been so blind? The weight of her mistake pressed down on her, suffocating. But beneath the guilt, a spark of anger flared. She wouldn't let Mark get away with this. Not without a fight. As the sun rose over the Preston home, Emily made a silent vow. She would uncover the whole truth, no matter what it cost. And somewhere, far out at sea, George felt a strange sense of hope. The game was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. The cruise ship was a world apart from the life George Preston had known. As the vessel cut through the Atlantic, the hum of engines and the distant laughter of vacationers filled the air, but George felt like a ghost drifting through someone else's dream. He spent his days wandering the decks, watching the endless blue horizon, his mind replaying every moment of the last few weeks. The betrayal stung deeper with every mile that separated him from home. He tried to distract himself with the ship's amenities, lavish buffets, live music, even a game of cards with a group of retirees from Florida, but nothing could shake the feeling that he'd been exiled, cast out by the very people he loved most. On the third night, as the ship docked briefly in Nassau, George sat alone at the bar, nursing a glass of bourbon. The bartender, a wiry man with kind eyes, struck up a conversation. "You look like a man with a lot on his mind," he said, sliding a bowl of peanuts across the counter. George managed a weak smile. "You could say that. Family trouble." The bartender nodded, as if he'd heard it all before. "Sometimes the people closest to us cut the deepest. But you strike me as someone who's not done fighting." George looked up, surprised by the man's insight. "What makes you say that?" The bartender shrugged. "You've got the look of a man who's lost everything but still has something left to prove." The words lingered with George as he returned to his cabin. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the one-way ticket on the nightstand. He turned it over in his hands, searching for answers. Why had Emily agreed to this? Was she really so blind, or was she just afraid? He thought of the envelope he'd left behind, the evidence that could unravel Mark's scheme. He could only hope Emily would find it before it was too late. The next morning, George received a message on his phone, a number he didn't recognize. The text was brief, but it sent a jolt through his chest. "Your house isn't as empty as you think. Watch your back." George's hands trembled as he read the words. Was it a warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? He tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. He paced the cabin, mind racing. Had Mark sent someone after him? Or was there an ally he didn't know about? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but it also sparked a new determination. He wasn't powerless. He still had friends, old colleagues, loyal employees, people who owed him favors. He began making calls, reaching out to anyone who might have information about what was happening back home. Each conversation revealed more of Mark's treachery, layoffs, shady business deals, even rumors that Mark was planning to sell the company outright. George's anger simmered, but he kept his voice steady, gathering every scrap of evidence he could. Meanwhile, back at the Preston house, Emily was unraveling. She spent hours poring over her father's letter, comparing the documents to the ones Mark had given her. The discrepancies were glaring: dates that didn't match, signatures that looked forged, transactions she'd never approved. She confronted Mark, her voice shaking. "Why are there documents with my name on them that I never signed?" Mark's face darkened. "You're imagining things, Em. Your father's just trying to turn you against me." But Emily wasn't convinced. She started digging deeper, calling the family lawyer, reaching out to old friends of her father's. The more she learned, the more the truth came into focus. Mark had orchestrated everything, using her trust as a weapon. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Mark became more controlling, monitoring Emily's calls, questioning her every move. Emily felt trapped, but she clung to her father's words, "You have to see the truth for yourself." On the ship, George received another message, this time from an old friend who still worked at the hardware store. "Mark's making moves. He's talking about selling. People are scared." George's jaw tightened. He knew he had to act, but he was thousands of miles away, cut off from everything he'd built. That night, as the ship sailed under a sky full of stars, George made a decision. He would not let Mark destroy his legacy. He would fight, even if it meant starting from scratch. He began drafting a plan, using every resource at his disposal. He wrote emails, made calls, and started piecing together a case against Mark, not for the courts, but for the court of family and community opinion. He knew that if he could expose Mark's lies, the truth would spread like wildfire. The next morning, George awoke to a knock at his cabin door. He opened it to find the bartender from the night before, holding a small envelope. "This came for you," the man said, his eyes serious. George took the envelope, heart pounding. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a message scrawled in familiar handwriting, "Don't give up. I'm starting to see the truth. Love, Emily." Relief and hope surged through George. His daughter was waking up. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since he'd boarded the ship, George felt a glimmer of hope. The game was changing, and he was ready to play his part. As the ship sailed on, George looked out at the endless horizon, a new resolve burning in his chest. Mark had underestimated him, and soon he would regret it. Back in Ohio, the Preston house was no longer a home. The air was thick with suspicion and unspoken accusations, every room echoing with the tension between Emily and Mark. Emily barely slept, haunted by her father's words and the damning evidence she'd uncovered. She kept the envelope hidden in her purse, checking it obsessively, as if the truth inside might change if she looked away. Mark, sensing her distance, grew more irritable and controlling. He started locking his office door, taking calls outside, and snapping at Emily for the smallest things. "You're distracted, Em. We need to focus on the business," he'd say, but his eyes darted nervously whenever she mentioned her father. Emily's doubts grew with every passing day. She called the family lawyer, pretending to ask about routine paperwork, but her real goal was to confirm the signatures on the property transfer. The lawyer hesitated, then admitted, "Emily, I thought you were aware. Mark brought in documents with your signature weeks ago. Everything's already in his name." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She hung up, her hands shaking, and locked herself in the bathroom to cry. Downstairs, Mark was on the phone, his voice low and urgent. "No, she doesn't suspect a thing. Just keep the pressure on. We need to close the deal before she changes her mind." Emily pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding. "Deal? What deal?" She remembered the rumors she'd heard from old employees. Mark was planning to sell Preston Hardware, the business her father had spent his life building. Rage and guilt twisted inside her. How could she have let this happen? How could she have been so blind? That night, Emily confronted Mark, her voice trembling but determined. "Are you selling the business?" Mark's eyes narrowed. "Where did you hear that? Answer me, Mark. Are you?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "It's none of your concern. The business is mine now. You signed it over, remember?" Emily's anger flared. "I never agreed to this. You tricked me. You tricked my father." Mark's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Your father was holding you back. I did what needed to be done." Emily recoiled, realizing just how far Mark was willing to go. She retreated to her room, clutching her father's letter, and began making a list of everyone who might help her. Old friends, loyal employees, anyone who still believed in the Preston name. Meanwhile, on the cruise ship, George was restless. He spent his days on the phone, piecing together the puzzle from afar. Every call brought new revelations. Mark had fired half the staff, liquidated assets, and was courting buyers for the business. But George also heard something else, a growing sense of unease among the community. People were talking, whispering about Mark's sudden rise and George's mysterious absence. The Preston name still meant something, and not everyone was willing to let it go without a fight. One evening, as George watched the sun set over the ocean, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Emily. "Dad, I know everything now. I'm so sorry. I need your help." Relief and pride flooded George's chest. His daughter was finally seeing the truth. He called her immediately, his voice steady and reassuring. "Emily, listen to me. You're stronger than you think. Gather everything you can, documents, emails, anything that proves what Mark's done. I'll guide you through this." Emily nodded, wiping away tears. "I'm scared, Dad. What if he finds out? He already suspects. But you have the truth on your side. And you have me." That night, Emily began her own investigation, digging through Mark's files, copying emails, and reaching out to trusted friends. Each discovery fueled her determination. She realized Mark's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating her father, it was underestimating her. The next morning, Mark found Emily in the study, surrounded by papers. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Emily met his gaze, her voice calm and clear. "I'm taking back what's ours." Mark laughed, but there was fear in his eyes. "You're too late, Em. The deal's almost done." Emily stood her ground. "We'll see about that." As Mark stormed out, Emily's phone buzzed again. Another message from her father. "Remember, the truth always comes out. I'm proud of you." The family was unraveling, but for the first time, Emily felt hope. She wasn't alone. The battle for the Preston legacy had begun in earnest, and she was ready to fight. And far out at sea, George smiled, knowing the tide was finally turning. Mark's confidence was his greatest weapon and his greatest flaw. As the days passed, he grew bolder, certain that Emily was too shaken to challenge him and that George was gone for good. He strutted through the Preston house as if he'd always belonged, barking orders at staff, making calls at all hours, and boasting to his friends about his new empire. But arrogance breeds carelessness, and Mark was no exception. One afternoon, while Mark was out meeting a potential buyer, Emily seized her chance. She slipped into his office, heart pounding, and began searching through his desk drawers. She found contracts, emails, and a flash drive labeled "Final Transfer." Her hands shook as she plugged it into the computer. The files were a goldmine: scanned documents, correspondence with lawyers, and, most damning of all, a video recording. Emily clicked play, her breath catching as she watched Mark sitting across from a notary, forging her signature on the property transfer. The notary, clearly uncomfortable, asked, "Are you sure your wife agreed to this?" Mark's reply was cold and dismissive. "She trusts me. She doesn't need to know the details." Emily's stomach twisted with anger and shame. She copied the files onto her own drive, her resolve hardening. This was the proof she needed, not just for herself, but for everyone Mark had deceived. As she finished, she heard the front door slam. Mark was home early. Emily yanked the drive from the computer and hid it in her pocket, forcing herself to stay calm. Mark stormed into the office, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing in here?" Emily met his gaze, her voice steady. "Looking for answers. You've been lying to me, Mark. I know everything." For a moment, Mark's mask slipped, revealing a flash of panic. But he quickly recovered, sneering. "You're confused, Em. Your father's poisoned you against me." Emily stood her ground. "No, Mark. You did this to yourself." Mark's anger flared, but Emily refused to back down. She left the office, clutching the flash drive like a lifeline. Upstairs, she locked her door and called her father. George answered on the first ring, his voice full of hope and worry. "Emily, are you all right?" "Dad, I have proof. Mark forged my signature. I have it all on video." George's relief was palpable. "That's it, sweetheart. That's what we needed. Now listen carefully. Don't let him know you have it. We need to be smart about this." Emily nodded, wiping away tears. "I'm scared, Dad. He's not the man I thought he was." "I know, Emily. But you're not alone. I'm with you every step of the way." That night, Emily barely slept. She replayed the video over and over, each viewing fueling her determination. She made copies of the files, hiding them in different places, and sent one to her father for safekeeping. Meanwhile, Mark grew increasingly paranoid. He sensed Emily slipping away, but he didn't know how much she knew. He tried to charm her, then threatened her, but Emily was done being manipulated. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, gathering allies among the staff and reaching out to old friends of her father's. Word began to spread. Mark's grip on the Preston legacy was slipping. On the cruise ship, George felt a surge of pride and anticipation. He knew the endgame was near. He called Emily every day, guiding her through each step, helping her build a case that would expose Mark for who he truly was. The community, once silent, began to rally around Emily. Former employees offered statements, Friends shared stories of Mark's deceit, and even the family lawyer admitted he'd been pressured by Mark. The tide was turning, and Mark was running out of options. One evening, as Emily prepared for a family meeting, she found a letter from her father tucked into her purse. She opened it, tears streaming down her face as she read his words of love and encouragement. "You are stronger than you know, Emily. The Preston legacy is yours to protect. I believe in you." The mistake had been made, and now the truth was unstoppable. Emily was ready to confront Mark, not just for herself, but for her father, her family, and the future of everything they'd built. The stage was set for a reckoning that would shake the Preston family to its core. And as George watched the sun rise over the ocean, he knew the moment of truth was finally at hand. The Preston family had always gathered on Sundays, a tradition George cherished even after Linda's passing. Now, with the house under Mark's control, the old rituals felt hollow, but Emily insisted on a family meeting. She invited Mark's parents, her own cousins, and a few trusted friends from the business, people who remembered what the Preston name once stood for. Mark, sensing something was off, tried to cancel, but Emily stood firm. "We need to talk, all of us. It's important." The living room filled with uneasy faces, the air thick with anticipation. Mark paced near the fireplace, his smile brittle, while Emily sat quietly, the flash drive hidden in her pocket. She'd spent the night preparing, reviewing her father's instructions, and rehearsing what she needed to say. As the last guest arrived, Emily stood and cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming. I know things have changed a lot lately, and I think it's time we talk about what's really happening." Mark cut in, his voice smooth but strained. "There's nothing to worry about. I've got everything under control. The business is in good hands." Emily ignored him, her gaze steady. "That's not true, Mark. You've lied to all of us. You forged my signature, stole the business, and tried to sell everything my father built." Gasps rippled through the room. Mark's face flushed, but he tried to laugh it off. "That's ridiculous. She's confused. George has been filling her head with nonsense from afar." Emily shook her head. "No, Mark. I have proof." She plugged the flash drive into the TV, and the room fell silent as the video played. Mark's voice filled the space, cold and unmistakable. "She trusts me. She doesn't need to know the details." The notary's nervous questions, the unmistakable sound of a pen scratching out Emily's name, every detail was there, undeniable. Mark lunged for the remote, but Emily's cousin blocked him. "Let it play," he said, his voice hard. When the video ended, the room erupted in shocked whispers. Mark's parents stared at him in horror, and Emily's friends looked at her with newfound respect. Mark tried to bluster, but the evidence was overwhelming. "You don't understand. George was going to ruin everything. I saved this family." Emily's voice was calm but fierce. "You betrayed us. You used me, and you tried to erase my father from his own legacy." At that moment, George's face appeared on the TV. He'd sent a video message from the cruise, his voice steady and full of dignity. "To everyone in this room, I want you to know the truth. I built Preston Hardware for my family, for this community. I trusted Mark, and I was wrong. But I never stopped believing in Emily, or in the values that made us who we are. The Preston name stands for honesty, hard work, and loyalty. Don't let anyone take that away." The room was silent as George's message ended. Emily looked around, her eyes shining with tears. "I'm taking back what's ours. If you believe in this family, stand with me." One by one, the guests nodded, some stepping forward to offer support. Mark, cornered and desperate, tried to defend himself, but no one listened. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she saw a path forward, a way to restore her father's legacy and heal the wounds Mark had caused. As the meeting ended, Emily hugged her cousins, her friends, and even Mark's parents, who apologized for ever doubting her. Mark stood alone, his empire crumbling around him. That night, Emily called her father, her voice trembling with relief and pride. "We did it, Dad. Everyone knows the truth now." George's voice was warm and full of love. "I'm proud of you, Emily. You found your strength. That's all I ever wanted." The revelation had shattered Mark's hold on the family, but the real victory was Emily's. She had reclaimed her dignity, her family, and the Preston legacy. And as George watched the stars from his cabin, he knew the battle was nearly won. The days after the family meeting were a blur of emotion and revelation for Emily. The truth was out, but the damage Mark had done ran deep. The business was in shambles, employees were scared, and the Preston name, once a symbol of trust, was now whispered about with pity and suspicion. Emily felt the weight of it all pressing down on her, guilt gnawing at her for not seeing through Mark sooner. She spent long hours in her father's old office, sorting through files, making calls, and piecing together the full extent of Mark's betrayal. Each new discovery was a fresh wound, accounts drained, loyal staff dismissed, contracts signed under false pretenses. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how close she'd come to losing everything her father had built. But beneath the guilt, a new fire burned. Emily was determined to make things right, not just for her father, but for herself and everyone who had believed in the Preston legacy. One afternoon, as she sifted through a box of old correspondence, she found a letter she'd never seen before. It was addressed to her in her father's handwriting, dated just days before he left for the cruise. Her hands shook as she opened it, tears welling in her eyes as she read his words. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means you've started to see the truth. I know how much you wanted to believe in Mark, and I don't blame you. Love can blind us to the faults of those closest to us. But I also know your heart, and I trust you to do what's right. The Preston name is more than a business, it's a promise. Don't let anyone take that from you. I love you always. Dad." The letter broke something open inside her. For the first time since George left, Emily allowed herself to grieve, not just for the loss of her father's trust, but for the part of herself that had been so easily manipulated. She wept for the employees who'd lost their jobs, for the customers who'd been let down, and for the family she'd almost destroyed. But when the tears dried, she felt lighter, stronger. She called her father, her voice steady. "Dad, I found your letter. I'm so sorry for everything. I want to fix this, but I don't know where to start." George's voice was gentle but firm. "Start by forgiving yourself, Emily. Then do what you know is right. The rest will follow." Emily took his advice to heart. She reached out to the staff Mark had fired, inviting them back to help rebuild. She met with a family lawyer, presenting all the evidence she'd gathered. Together, They began the process of reversing the fraudulent transfers and restoring the business to its rightful owner. The community, once wary, began to rally around her. Old customers returned, grateful to see a Preston back at the helm. Emily worked tirelessly, determined to earn back their trust. Meanwhile, Mark grew increasingly isolated. His friends abandoned him, his reputation in ruins. He tried to intimidate Emily, but she stood her ground, protected by the truth and the support of those who mattered most. The turning point came when Emily called a meeting of the entire staff. She stood before them, her father's letter in hand, and spoke from the heart. "I let you down. I let my family down. But I promise you, from this day forward, things will be different. We're going to rebuild this business together, the right way." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in months, Emily felt hope. She called her father that night, her voice full of pride. "We're coming back, Dad. I can feel it." George smiled on the other end of the line, his heart swelling with pride. "I never doubted you, Emily. Not for a second." The Preston family had reached its lowest point, but from the ashes of betrayal, something stronger was rising. Emily had found her strength, and with it, the power to reclaim her family's legacy. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and this time, the Prestons were fighting together. The day of reckoning arrived with a chill in the air, as if the whole town sensed that something was about to change. Emily called a meeting at the hardware store, inviting not just the staff but also family, friends, and a few trusted community members who had watched the Preston legacy unfold for decades. The store, once bustling and bright, had grown quiet under Mark's rule, but today it buzzed with anticipation. Mark arrived late, his face drawn and defensive, eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Emily stood at the front, her father's letter in her pocket and the flash drive with Mark's confession ready to play. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, and began. "Thank you all for coming. I know the last few months have been hard on everyone. I want to be honest about what's happened and what comes next." Mark tried to interrupt, but Emily raised her hand, her voice steady and clear. "Mark, you've had your say. Now it's my turn." She turned to the staff, her voice trembling with emotion. "My father trusted me to protect this business, and I failed. I let someone into our family who didn't deserve it. But I'm here to make things right." She nodded to the store manager, who dimmed the lights and played the video from the flash drive. Mark's voice filled the room, cold and calculating, as he forged Emily's signature and dismissed the notary's concerns. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of someone quietly weeping in the back. Mark's face turned ashen. He tried to bluster, to claim the video was fake, but no one believed him. The staff, many of whom had lost their jobs or been mistreated, stared at him with open contempt. Emily faced Mark, her voice unwavering. "You lied to me. You lied to everyone. You tried to destroy everything my father built, but you failed. The truth is out, and you have no power here anymore." Mark's anger boiled over. "You think you can just erase me? After everything I've done for this family?" Emily shook her head, her eyes full of sorrow and resolve. "You did nothing for this family but take. You used my love and trust as weapons. But I'm done letting you hurt us." At that moment, the front door opened, and a hush fell over the room. George Preston stepped inside, his presence commanding and calm. He looked older, perhaps, but there was a new strength in his eyes, a quiet dignity that silenced even Mark. The staff erupted in applause, some rushing forward to shake his hand or hug him. George raised a hand for quiet, then turned to Mark. "You thought you could erase me, Mark. You thought you could steal my family and my life's work. But you forgot one thing. The truth always finds its way home." Mark tried to speak, but George cut him off. "You're finished here. The community knows what you've done. The family knows. And most importantly, Emily knows. You have nothing left." Mark's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face, but found none. Emily stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "It's over, Mark. Leave." Mark hesitated, then turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the store. The staff cheered, some crying, others laughing in relief. George embraced Emily, tears in his eyes. "You did it, sweetheart. You saved us." Emily hugged him back, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." The confrontation was over, but the healing had just begun. The Preston family, battered but unbroken, stood together at the heart of the business they loved, ready to rebuild and move forward, stronger than ever. Mark's humiliation was swift and absolute. Word of his betrayal spread through the town like wildfire, carried by whispers in coffee shops and knowing glances at the grocery store. The Preston name, once threatened, now became a rallying cry for justice and resilience. Mark found himself shunned by everyone he'd tried to impress. Old friends, business contacts, even his own parents, who called Emily in tears to apologize for ever doubting her. He tried to salvage his reputation, spinning stories about being set up, but no one listened. The evidence was too clear, the community's memory too long. He was forced to move out of the Preston house, packing his things in silence while Emily watched from the doorway, her face a mask of sorrow and resolve. She didn't gloat or lash out. She simply let him go, knowing that his punishment was already complete. Mark's final mistake was underestimating the strength of the family he tried to destroy. As he drove away, the house seemed to breathe again, sunlight streaming through the windows as if welcoming the Prestons home. Emily and George stood together in the foyer, the weight of months of fear and doubt finally lifting. The staff returned to the hardware store, greeted by George's warm handshake and Emily's heartfelt apologies. "We lost our way," she told them, her voice breaking. "But we're back, and we're going to make things right." The employees, many of whom had worked for the Prestons for decades, rallied around them, eager to rebuild what Mark had tried to tear down. The community followed suit, customers returning in droves, eager to support the family that had always supported them. George took his place behind the counter once more, his presence a comfort to everyone who walked through the door. Emily worked tirelessly by his side, learning the business from the ground up, determined to earn back the trust she'd lost. Together, they made changes, restoring old traditions, reaching out to former employees, and launching new initiatives to give back to the town. The Preston hardware store became more than just a business. It became a symbol of hope and second chances. Mark, meanwhile, drifted from job to job, his reputation in ruins. He tried to contact Emily, begging for forgiveness, but she ignored his calls. She had nothing left to say to the man who had nearly destroyed her family. The final blow came when Emily filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and attaching the evidence of Mark's fraud. The process was swift and decisive, leaving Mark with nothing but regret. Emily's strength in the face of betrayal inspired others, and soon she was invited to speak at local events, sharing her story of resilience and redemption. George watched with pride as his daughter blossomed, her confidence growing with each passing day. The family gathered for Sunday dinners once more, laughter and love filling the house that had once felt so empty. Emily apologized to her father, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have listened. I should have seen what he was doing." George hugged her tightly, his own eyes wet with tears. "You came back, Emily. That's all that matters. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do to fix them." The Preston family was whole again, their dignity restored. The scars of betrayal remained, but they served as a reminder of the strength that comes from facing the truth and standing together. As the sun set over the town, George sat on the porch, watching Emily laugh with her cousins, the sound of hope and healing echoing through the air. The humiliation Mark suffered was complete, but the triumph of the Prestons was just beginning. In the weeks that followed Mark's departure, the Preston family began to heal in ways George had once feared were impossible. The house, once heavy with secrets and suspicion, filled again with the sounds of life, pots clanging in the kitchen, laughter drifting from the living room, and the steady hum of hope returning. Emily moved back into her childhood bedroom, finding comfort in the familiar creak of the floorboards and the faded posters on the walls. She threw herself into the work of rebuilding, not just the business, but the trust she'd lost with her father and the community. George watched her with a mixture of pride and relief, grateful for every small sign that his daughter was finding her way back. The hardware store, too, began to thrive. Old employees returned, bringing with them stories of the early days and a renewed sense of loyalty. Customers who had drifted away under Mark's management came back, eager to support the family that had always stood by them. Emily and George worked side by side, their bond stronger than ever, each day a step further from the pain Mark had caused. But the wounds were still there, and some nights Emily would sit on the porch with George, her voice barely above a whisper. "I still can't believe I let him do all that, Dad. I feel so foolish." George would squeeze her hand, his voice gentle. "You loved him, Mem. That's not foolish. That's human. What matters is you saw the truth and you did something about it." Emily nodded, wiping away a tear. "I just wish Mom was here to see us now." George smiled, looking up at the stars. "She'd be proud of you." "I know I am." As the days passed, Emily finalized her divorce from Mark, the last legal ties severed with a sense of bittersweet relief. Mark, now a pariah in the community, left town quietly, his name a cautionary tale whispered among those who remembered his arrogance. Emily never looked back. She focused on the future, determined to honor her father's legacy and build something even stronger. One evening, as they closed up the store, George called Emily into his office. He handed her a small, battered box, the same one he'd taken on the cruise. "There's something I want you to see," he said, his eyes twinkling with a secret. Inside the box were the original deeds to the house and the business, along with a letter from George's lawyer. Emily's eyes widened as she read the letter, realizing what her father had done. "Dad, you never really signed everything over to Mark, did you?" George shook his head, a sly smile on his lips. "I saw what he was doing, Em. I made sure there was always a way back." The documents he had were copies, legal-looking, but worthless. The real ones were with my lawyer the whole time. Emily laughed through her tears, hugging her father tightly. "You outsmarted him. You really did." George hugged her back, his heart full. "I had to protect you, even when you didn't know you needed it." The final twist restored not just their property, but their sense of security and pride. The Preston name was safe, the business thriving, and the family stronger than ever. As they walked home together, the lights of the hardware store glowing behind them, Emily felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She looked at her father, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." George smiled, his arm around her shoulders. "We did it together, Em. That's what family is for." The aftermath of Mark's betrayal had left scars, but it had also revealed the unbreakable bond between father and daughter, a bond that no amount of deceit could ever destroy. The first Sunday after everything was settled, the Preston house was alive with the warmth of family and forgiveness. The kitchen bustled with cousins and old friends, the table groaned under the weight of home-cooked food, and laughter echoed through the halls that had once felt so empty. George sat at the head of the table, his heart full as he watched Emily move among their guests, her smile genuine and her eyes bright with hope. The scars of betrayal were still there, but they had faded, replaced by a new sense of unity and purpose. After dinner, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, Emily found her father on the porch, the same place they'd shared so many quiet talks. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence was comfortable, filled with all the things they no longer needed to say. Finally, Emily turned to George, her voice trembling with emotion. "Dad, I need to say this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not listening, for doubting you, for letting Mark come between us. I should have trusted you." George reached over, taking her hand in his. "Emily, you don't have to apologize. We all make mistakes. What matters is that you found your way back. You fought for our family, for our name. I couldn't be prouder." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. "I just wanted to make you proud. I wanted to be strong like you." George smiled, his own eyes misty. "You are strong. Stronger than you know. You faced the truth, even when it hurt. You stood up for what was right. That's all I ever wanted for you." The porch light flickered on, casting a warm glow over them as the rest of the family joined them outside. Emily's cousins brought out dessert, and the children played in the yard, their laughter a promise of better days ahead. George looked around at the people he loved, the home he'd fought so hard to protect, and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The Preston legacy was safe, not because of the business or the house, but because of the love and resilience that bound them together. As the evening wore on, Emily stood and raised a glass. "To family," she said, her voice clear and strong. "To forgiveness, to second chances, and to never giving up on each other." The toast was met with cheers and applause, and for the first time in a long time, George allowed himself to believe that everything would be all right. Later, as the house quieted and the guests drifted home, George sat alone on the porch, the cool night air filled with the scent of cut grass and distant laughter. He thought of Linda, of the years they'd built together, and of the daughter who had finally come home. He whispered a silent thank you to the stars, grateful for the chance to start again. In the end, it wasn't revenge that brought peace, but forgiveness and the courage to face the truth. The Preston family had been tested, but they had emerged stronger, their bonds unbreakable. And as George closed his eyes, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, father and daughter, side by side, with nothing left to hide. The story of the Prestons was far from over, but for now, they had everything they needed: love, trust, and the promise of a new beginning.